Hello and welcome to another episode of Clean Talk. I'm your host, Brad Whitchurch, and we are coming to you live from Orlando, Florida. It is Wednesday, October 5th, and we're very excited to have our guest today. Marc-Oliver Wright is with PDI Healthcare. He's a certified infection preventionist. We're excited to have you on the show. Marc-Oliver, welcome to Clean Talk.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on the show, and we're big fans of your work and the work at PDI. What can you tell our audience about yourself and why you're on Clean Talk today?
Well, thank you. Fundamentally, first, second, and third, I'm an infection preventionist. I currently work at PDI, but I've spent most of my adult working life in the field of infection prevention and control. And I got into this, well, everyone's journey into infection prevention is a little bit different. Some people just get assigned the task. They're voluntold that they're now the infection preventionist for their facility. I actually walked into this. I think it's especially unique what the precipitating factors are that, kind of brings people into this field. And fundamentally, I was a kid that had a German mother who made her son sit down at the table every night and say, spend 5 minutes thinking about what you want to do with the rest of your life. And when I was a teenager, I was reading two books the same summer. I read Randy Schultz's book, And the Band Played On, which is about the early days of the AIDS crisis. And then I turned around and read Stephen King's The Stand, and then decided that those were two books that I saw the word epidemiology for the first time in. And so that's what led me to the decision I wanted to be an epidemiologist when I grew up. And I went into undergrad with that first and foremost in mind. And then, of course, a series of factors always comes into people's career paths that, might change or modify things a little bit. But whether it's an internship here or a volunteer project there. But eventually it led me to hospital-based epidemiology and infection prevention, and the realization that epidemiology can actually be global, national, regional, or even within the four walls of a building. So once you start looking for something, you find the things that you love. I think it was the Peace Corps that had the motto a number of years ago, the Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love. I would say that that person who came up with that ad campaign deserves an award, but they never spoke to an infection preventionist.
Well, I think that's absolutely appropriate. And we love having infection preventionists on this show. And we're hoping to encourage more people to get into infection prevention, right? So we feel very fortunate to have you here. And shout out to Stephen King's The Stand, probably one of the best Stephen King books, I think, a long one, but a page turner. So I find that fascinating. Well, we're really excited to have you on the show. And I'd love to hear about what you're doing as an infection preventionist with PDI Healthcare.
Yeah, so this is actually a complete career shift for me, or at least it seemed like it. And in the last 3 years I've been at PDI, I realized it's not that much different. So instead of being an infection preventionist for a facility or a health system, I am a clinical science liaison at PDI, which means that I'm basically an infection preventionist for all the hospitals in a given territory, which in my case ranges from the Dakotas in the west to Ohio and Michigan in the east, from Minnesota down to Tennessee. If you are a hospital in one of those states of that part of the country, I'm your clinical science liaison. Now, what that actually means is that I'm the one that helps the end users. I help on two different fronts. One is I help the end users with any questions that come up with the use of PDI-related products or contexts in which they're used. And that can include things like going to a facility and offering to do clinical assessments where they are looking at an increase in central line associated bloodstream infections. They're not quite sure why. They'd like an outside pair of eyes to take a look at it. I'll go in there and observe insertion, care, maintenance technique, and then provide recommendations on how what I've observed might be different from recommended best practice or national guidelines. And then on the PDI company side, I also act as sort of the voice of the end user. Due to my career in infection prevention and healthcare, I can provide insight to research and development opportunities, conversations about what are the important and pressing things, and as well as educating our team at PDI about new and emerging pathogens. Not like we've had any of those since I started. So I really ended up being an infection preventionist for a bigger, broader audience, which is actually kind of fun.
Well, I think that's critical, and we don't see enough of that. We talk a lot on this show about the communication between the solutions providers and the end users solving problems that healthcare faces. And I think it's a great way to make sure we're speaking the same language when you can be an infection preventionist for a solution provider, helping the infection preventionist on the clinical side. For our audience, Marc-Oliver, can you tell us a little bit more about PDI? I think most of our healthcare audience is familiar with PDI, but tell us a little bit about PDI.
So, PDI is fundamentally a global infection prevention and innovation leader in what they aspire to be as a trusted advisor for our customers, and that they make and manufacture instruments and tools that are used in healthcare. And what we are probably most well known for is, of course, our disinfectant wipes. So the super sandy cloth, or what's known as, colloquially, lost that word, as purple top. We have color-coded canisters and containers of different disinfectant formulations, but that's not where PDI starts and ends. So, for example, there's also the interventional product line for patient care, which includes things like chlorhexidine impregnated swabs and swab sticks for both maintaining central lines in terms of catheter hub disinfection, as well as skin antisepsis for procedures. We have a nasal decolonization product line for decolonizing your patients both pre-surgically as well as in the ICU to help prevent collapses as well. And then as recently as November of 2019, PDI acquired a majority share of what is TrueD, which is the smart UVC supplemental no-touch disinfection system. And so together that all combines into sort of a infection prevention product supply and warehouse, or a powerhouse. But it's really very much mission driven. It's a US-based company, still family owned. And our CEO actually starts out, every one of our meetings basically saying, because of what we do every day, someone's mother, brother, father, son, sister, aunt, uncle, child, or lover won't get sick, die, or suffer. So it is very much a mission-driven organization, to put it lightly. And hopefully that kind of gives a broad overview.
And the broad portfolio to address infection prevention, which we appreciate here. I do want to talk about the UV acquisition, but the products you mentioned, my understanding is that PDI has an exclusive product for healthcare that is the only EPA validated persistent kill product on the market. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is interesting. So there's one of the products is in our EOC product line. It's called Sani 24. And the 24 stands or represents 24 hours. So with the EPA, you have to go through specific testing methodologies in order to attain a claim and therefore sell a product in the United States as a disinfectant. You can't just mix up something in your kitchen, put a fancy label on it, and sell it on the street. That'll get you in a whole bunch of trouble. So there's very
specific. No Bacardi hand sanitizer at PDI.
No, okay. No, it might smell like fun, but it really isn't. It really isn't.
No.
So they had this for sprays, and then they developed another testing criteria for wipes, and that was always for immediate use disinfection. And what you want to think about is anytime you disinfect something in the routine world, let's say before this product was available, you would disinfect a exam table, for example. You would use, and it doesn't want to matter, disinfectant. Of course, it'd be nice if it was PDI, but if it's not, it's a hospital grade disinfectant. You would apply it, let it sit there for the wet contact or kill time as necessary, and then it's safe for that table to be used for the next patient. However, at any point in time after that disinfection has occurred, that surface can and will become recontaminated. That's why you wipe down the exam table after each and every patient. With Sani 24, they actually were able to go through a different and new EPA testing criteria called a residual activity claim. And what that means, and says it quite nicely, is that after you apply that disinfectant, that for some period of time, when organisms are deposited on that surface after you've disinfected it once, that surface has a shield on it that will kill certain organisms for a particular period of time or number of touches or abrasions. And what that translates to on the Sani 24 side, basically, is that this is a product that not only has immediate kill, like you are used to with your routine disinfectants, that after 1 minute, most of the organisms that you're looking to kill are gone, but for the next 24 hours, the escape pathogens, which are the sort of the moniker or acronym that's used to describe a group of organisms that are responsible for basically causing approximately 40% of all healthcare associated infections, and includes things like Staphylococcus aureus, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Escherichia coli. These should be relatively familiar to the infection prevention audience, but the escape pathogens, it kills those escape pathogens for the next 24 hours after a single application or 96 touches. And that means you can have, the analogy that I often use is that, one of the places that might be tempting to use this on is like elevator buttons in a hospital, right? But if you ever see me call an elevator, I don't press the button once like a rational, normal human being does. I stand there and press it about 10 or 15 times. And so the PDI Sanity 24 is effective against those escape pathogens for 24 hours or 96 touches. As an infection preventionist, I would go into work every day and I would go walking through, common areas of the hospital on the way to my office or whatever it is. And I would invariably look around, and the thing is that for the infection preventionist, everything is their environment. Everything from the parking lot to the basement to the top floor, it's all our responsibility from an environmental standpoint. And I would invariably go walking past areas and go, man, that doesn't get cleaned as often as it needs to. A really good, simple example of this would be your emergency department or urgent care waiting room. It is hard to get into. It is never slow, not in any facility I ever worked. And you're lucky to get in there when you can, if you can, however you can. And it probably varies, somewhere between once a shift or maybe, unfortunately, maybe as little as once a day, those surfaces are going to get disinfected. Well, that's great if you're the first person sitting down after environmental services has cleaned and disinfected that surface. But what if you're the 30th person sitting down since it was last cleaned? Anyway, that's just a way of saying that we, if we're being really honest with ourselves, we know that some services are not getting cleaned and disinfected as often as they need or should be. And I'm not talking about non-dedicated patient care equipment, because I think we're relatively good about that. But I'm talking about, areas that can be underserved. And so what this allows for continuous active disinfection of those 6 escape pathogens after that simple application. This has been validated and published in a number of journals to date, where it's not just the company that devised the product and made the claim or approached the EPA and got the label, but independent researchers, independent people that don't work for PDI, don't get a cut of the budget, if you will, have gone out and evaluated this and have shown that it's largely effective. We don't know the number of organisms any surface can have before it's rendered or considered potentially unsafe. We know that it's more than 0, and then it's less than some number, but we don't know what that number is. But I would say that the more we look at it from the standpoint of let's get the organisms on the surfaces in our healthcare environments as low as reasonably possible without an expectation of sterility, the better off we are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Sanity 24, less cleaning for greater persistence, for superior infection prevention. That's an exciting product. And you mentioned the elevator buttons and how often you push them. I assume as an infection preventionist, you're doing it with your elbow. But it brings up the point that we talk about on this show all the time, is that there are many vectors of cross-contamination. And Dr. Rutala said that we're as likely to pick up pathogens from the environment as we are from our hands. Is that the strategy around the TrueD acquisition? Is it this approach to how can we have multiple modalities to address these multiple vectors? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, that kind of, let me get to the TrueD part in a second, because I think it kind of fits into this larger puzzle. So from a historical context perspective, we started appreciating the idea of bundling interventions in infection prevention probably right around the early 2000s. I'd say probably the most well-known or first largely recognized effort at this was the Peter Pronevost's attempt at reducing central line bloodstream infections at Johns Hopkins,
Yep.
where their team basically came up with this very long checklist that said, this is how you should insert a line, the do's and don'ts, and this is how you care for that line, and this is how you access that line, and this is what.
And it was very successful.
It was. Yes. And what we figured out is that when we bundle things together and we have high compliance across those individual elements of the bundle, we are likely to be more successful, right? And I think that has been served well. So there was the CLABSI prevention bundle, and then there was a VAP bundle that came out. And I think what we're looking at from the environmental standpoint is what PDI calls a layered approach. And what we mean by that is that if you look at all the layers that are involved in the cleaning and safety of your environment, that if you look at them in a very systematic way, you have the opportunity to maximize your efficacy, minimize your resources, and have the safest, potentially clean environment, right? So what that starts out with is looking at your policies and procedures and making sure that you've identified all the areas. If you ever go into a patient room that's occupied, you see all this equipment. And the question is, who cleans what? This has come up in every one of my organizations. Who cleans what? Now, environmental services is hesitant to potentially clean and disinfect very complicated medical pieces of equipment for fear of breaking it. You don't know how it works. You don't want to break it. If you do, you get in trouble. But they're very comfortable doing other services. But if that discussion has not been had, such that environmental services would not like to clean and disinfect, for example, the bladder scanner, then someone else needs to be identified that is going to clean and disinfect the bladder scanner. If someone hasn't come up with that list and that's not in a policy or a procedure, then the question invariably goes, well, who's cleaning it? Because if it's, if you get everybody around in the room, there's going to be a lot of not me's going on. Okay. So you start with the policies and procedures, and then you go down the path of identifying, okay, what products and how do we want to do this in the most efficient way possible, right? And there's different strategies around this as well, but helping to identify which products for which areas and which services. And then there comes in the element of, okay, let's recognize that even under the most ideal conditions or situations, that the practice of cleaning and disinfecting in the healthcare environment is very much a human-centered, human-driven process. Things don't clean themselves, usually. We'll get to that. At
least not yet, right?
Yeah. So you have to have training and orientation, competency, ongoing assessments, validation that the people doing the work are doing the work in a way that they're supposed to, that ideally is also efficient and safe for them as well, of course. But even under the perfect circumstance, you think about all the surfaces in a patient room. And I remember a researcher at one point in time quantified the exact square footage that if you take an average patient room, how much that actually is. What is the probability that you're going to miss a spot? You're going to miss an area. It's not zero. It's probably not even close. Even with these validation tools that we use, most places start out with somewhere between the 40 to 70% range of cleaning the surfaces that they're supposed to. And that's just high touch surfaces. And there's absolutely no evidence out there that says that high touch surfaces are any more likely to serve as a vector for a susceptible patient than low touch surfaces. There's all this focus and emphasis on, let's make sure we got the light switch and the doorknob and the door handle. But there's nothing that says it's the light switch that causes all your HAIs. We just happen to touch it a lot. So here's where 2D comes in, or other methods of supplemental no-touch disinfection. It recognizes that cleaning and disinfection is an imperfect human practice. With that recognition, you're able to say, okay, we're still going to do the best job that we can. We're going to still use the best products that we can in the most efficient way possible. We're still going to train. We're still going to monitor and provide feedback on performance. But then we're going to put in this added layer of protection and bring in this supplemental no-touch disinfecting device. Now, TrueD is unique in the aspect that it's able to deliver the dose of UV wavelength and light in a direct and indirect manner to the surfaces in the room by measuring and determining how long that cycle needs to run and at what dose. And it does this through its patented technology that takes into account the cubic square footage of the cubic footage of the room and the surfaces that it's aiming to disinfect. And then it adds this extra layer of protection that, and it does so in a couple of different ways. But the fact is that even if a patient's not on isolation, you don't know, for example, what they're colonized with, unless you're doing active surveillance testing, and that's largely fallen out of fashion. So it takes care of all the organisms that you know about, and more importantly, all the ones that you don't, in all the spots that you may or may not have missed. And it does so without tying up resources and time from a person perspective. You don't have someone having to go in there and move the machine around a bunch of times. You set it up, you close the door, you turn it on, you walk away, you start cleaning the next room that you're supposed to be cleaning.
So here at Clean Talk, we're big proponents of UV radiation, but it is imperfect. And that's why it's important to have a layered approach, right? That there's no silver bullet, pardon the pun. You need this layered approach. Our guest today is Marc-Oliver Wright. If you have a question for him, send it to us online. And Mark, we actually have several questions coming in. Let's take a second to answer those. We had talked initially about you being in infection prevention and how important it is to get more people into the infection prevention space. We have a question. Mark, what advice would you give a site IP who is interested in becoming a clinical liaison for a vendor? How often are you expected to travel within your role? So you've got a pretty exciting position as an infection preventionist. What can you tell folks about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually came up, of all my career transitions that I've made, this was probably the one that took the most amount of time. And it was because I really wanted to think it through thoroughly. I was not looking for a new role or new responsibility. I'm a parent of two young boys, and the idea of being away from them for long periods of time just did not seem like a great idea. So to answer the second question first, it was probably the question that I was posed most often during the interview process. How comfortable am I with traveling? What the expectations are? What it would be. On a regular basis, I probably travel a couple of days a month. There's a couple of days a month that I'm not sleeping in my own bed. And again, having two boys, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
You got to catch up on your sleep sometime. Right?
Exactly. So that was probably the thing I was most concerned about, because it varied widely and you'd heard these different reports. But I think a couple of things have happened. A lot of things have happened in the last 3 years. But one of those things is the recognition that a lot of the travel and responsibilities of engaging with our audience and our customers, when we couldn't do so, we figured out how to do it virtually. And so we're getting much better at that. So I think that has factored into the overall travel element not being as significant as it might have been in years past. How to get into a role like this? I can tell you how I got into a role like this.
Please.
The vice president of clinical affairs was a colleague of mine from many years, knowing each other through the infection prevention circles. It's a big, small group at the same time, if you know what I mean. So if you spend enough time working in infection prevention, especially if you're active in APIC, and I'm not talking about just the local chapters. I'm saying I'm a big proponent of get yourself to the APIC national events whenever you can. It's good for you. It's good for your ongoing competency development, and it's good for your networking opportunities. The number of people that I have seen, and this is probably also a consequence of the last 3 years, the number of seasoned IPs that I've seen that have transitioned to the private sector, if you will, is to me shockingly large. Not necessarily, in a bad way, just sort of, oh, now you're doing this now. That's interesting. But in my particular case, it was a colleague that I had been friends with for the better part of most of my 20 years in infection prevention, who reached out to me and said, you know what, Mark, we have this opportunity and you should take a look at it. I would say the other piece of advice I might offer is that when you're going down this path, I don't know about anyone else that's listening or anyone else on the call. Every time I've made a career transition, I learned a new lesson, and sometimes that lesson was an easy one, and sometimes that was a hard lesson to learn. I'd say the thing that matters the most to me as a professional these days is organizational culture. You have to like what you do. I don't care what job you have. If the culture is not right for you, you're not gonna last long, and you're not gonna be happy. And I would
I
say
couldn't
that the
agree more.
organization and the culture at PDI has been really great. I spent a lot of time asking a lot of questions of a lot of people about that. They were probably wondering what sort of weirdo this guy was, who's interviewing for this position. But that was what I determined was the most important thing to me, and I have not regretted it for a second.
And more people are thinking that way, right? This has become a significant deciding factor in the roles we take and the industries we choose. And you mentioned APIC, and as I'm sure you're aware, APIC has a significant initiative to get more people into infection prevention from more varied backgrounds. And so if you are interested in becoming an infection preventionist, check out APIC. It's apic.org for more information about that. We have a couple more questions, Mark. General question about PDI. How many hospitals is PDI involved with in the US and internationally? It's all of them?
Boy, I wish I could answer that question with a fact. I'm going to have to offer up a couple of statements that might give you a sense of the scope. I honestly don't know the exact number. Let's put it this way. So with regards to, I mentioned the EOC product line, and I mentioned Super Santa Claus, which everyone thinks of and knows as Purple Top. Purple Top is according to the last data I saw, the #1 disinfectant wipe used in hospitals in America today. The figure that I saw, I believe, was 70%. So that's not
impressive market share.
And that's just one wipe. I mean, there's a whole other colorful rainbow of canisters to choose from, and that's before you go down the interventional patient care and supplemental disinfection route. As mentioned, we do have an overseas market. I think the one that's probably most prominent, the one that I keep running into more often than not, is over in the UK. It's kind of interesting because the rules are different from country to country. So the rules with regards to what can be claimed as a disinfectant in the United States is different than what can be claimed as a disinfectant for the National Health Service in the UK. So, for example, not telling tales outside of school, you can find this on the website by searching carefully. In the US, we manufacture and sell something called Easy Screen, which is 70% isopropyl alcohol on a cloth. It is registered. It is not registered as a disinfectant because of requirements from the EPA that don't make that conducive as a standalone alcohol wipe. If, however, you go to the United Kingdom, they have what basically appears to be the exact same thing, the exact same formulation with a 2-minute wet contact kill time. So rules are different from country to country. I mentioned this for the audience because if you're going down the path of trying to identify an appropriate disinfectant for a particular piece of equipment, make sure that you're looking on the US-based side if that's where you're practicing. A lot of our hospitals are make purchasing decisions on the international scale. So, for example, Fisher Paykel is manufactured in New Zealand. New Zealand has different rules for disinfectants, and if you open up the manufacturer's instructions for use, their disinfectant section is likely going to include recommendations that may not fly quite as well over here in the US because they might be proposing something that is in fact not available as an EPA registered disinfectant. And then you're sort of shoved in the rock and hard place of IFU versus what a surveyor is going to do to you. So make sure that if I could offer one piece of advice for infection preventionists, whether you're seasoned or brand new to the field, in your organization, if someone from infection prevention is not sitting on your value analysis and capital equipment purchasing committees, they should be, because you're the only one that's going to be asking the question, how do I clean this? And you should do that before you buy it.
And there's so many crossover examples. So we have so much equipment that is a cross-contamination risk that question is never asked. And especially with EMR implementations, now all of a sudden we're going to all these mobile devices and it's an afterthought. Well, wait a minute. Is this the most dangerous device in the hospital? And we didn't even think about how we're going to clean it. So I couldn't agree with you more. We have several more questions, Mark. You're a popular guest. Derek Diaz says, great conversation so far. Mark, have you seen an increased fatigue in healthcare facilities surrounding infection prevention due to the perception that we are out of the woods with COVID? I think this is a great question, Marc-Oliver, because for the first time in a long time, we've seen an increase in hospital-acquired infections. To what do you attribute that? And is it fatigue?
Oh gosh, that we could do an entire podcast on this.
That's why we're here, Mark. That's why we're here.
Okay. Let's start with it. Let's start with a couple of things, right? So there have been some reports about the healthcare associated infections that went up during COVID. The CDC has acknowledged this. There's been a couple of papers out there that are all worth a read. The general thinking is, at least, and by general thinking means this has not been proven, but seems to make a lot of sense, and there is some data to support it, is that you had two things going on at the same time. You had a pandemic of epic proportions with sicker patients requiring more invasive devices for longer periods of time in a setting where they were under isolation conditions, such that all the things that we know about transmission-based precautions and the less frequent contact between provider and patient, and the quality and safety issues that arise from that those are all legitimate, reasonable concerns and issues. I would say that is probably a major factor, if not a fundamental primary factor. Take a look at any of your traditional HAIs. CLABSIs. Patients with COVID had central lines in for a lot longer than the average run-of-the-mill ICU patient, bar none. C. diff. Oh, did we use a little bit more antibiotics during a pandemic of respiratory proportions with superimposing pneumonias? Yeah, I think we did. Then you also have, so I think there's an argument to be made about the patient population in that case. The second piece of this, to the fatigue part, we saw a fundamental shift in how we staff our hospitals. I was in, I won't say what state or city I was in. I was in an ICU last December, doing clinical assessments again, yay for me. And there, they were almost half and half at that time, half COVID, half non-COVID. And I asked one of the staff members that I was working with, I said, what proportion of your team, i.e. in this case, it was nursing, what proportion of your team are travel nurses? And she said 75%.
Wow.
Now, there's nothing wrong with a travel provider of care. It's not that there's no competency issues. I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. But a major factor in your success in whatever profession you're doing is knowing your environment. How do things work here? I can be an infection preventionist at hospital A, show up at hospital B that I've never walked into, and guess what? I'm not going to be a successful infection preventionist right off the bat. Doesn't matter how smart or not smart I am. I need to know and understand how the organization works and functions. And that's even more critically important if you're providing direct patient care. So you had individuals that were coming in that, by baptism by fire, orientation by fire, learning the rules and the ropes of the road as quickly as possible, and then being thrown into an ICU where half the patients were COVID. So I think that you had those two superimposing things that led to what we saw with HAIs. And the estimates for those increases are all over the map. They range from 25%. I saw something as high as 450% increase.
Wow.
I think it's going to be very institutional dependent. I think you've, with regards to the profession of infection prevention, you've seen a lot of burnout. I attended APIC this year in June. It was the first in-person and hybrid event that they've held in a while. And my wife asked me, she's like, what do you think it's going to be like? And I said, I think it's going to be like the VFW hall of like 1947. Everyone's seen some action. We're all happy to be here. And the first thing that we're going to want is a drink.
Right. I think that's a great assessment. And I think that describes that conference fairly well. So we have some other questions here, Mark. Ginger asks, does PDI offer a service to where they are disinfecting bioburden from capital equipment such as surgical beds? So PDI is largely a product company. Do you have a service arm?
Currently, no. And I think in the interest of, I think I'm just going to leave it there. Currently,
okay. I felt like we were going to get a top secret teaser there, but we'll hold off on that one. And in terms of PDI solutions, it's a broad breadth of products, right? You have specific products for specific applications, specific pathogens, and that's why we talk about the layered approach, bringing all of that together. More questions, Mark. You're a popular guy. Mark, what can we expect to see in the future for infection prevention technology? And I guess I would reframe this to the discussion we just had. What can we do to change the cycle on the increase in hospital-acquired infections?
Well, I'm going to take those two separate ways. I'm going to take yours first, because frankly, it's a little easier. The first thing is, I think there has to be this has been commonly noted in the infection prevention community, a back to basics mentality. We have to approach this from the idea that things have been broken, and it's not necessarily about putting the pieces back together again, because it is a bit of a Humpty Dumpty out there in healthcare these days. But looking at it more holistically, and this is where I go down the path of human factors engineering and looking at, okay, I recognize that there's a problem. What are the elements that are contributing to this problem? And what are the elements that I'm not thinking about? And it's not so much of a root cause analysis. It's more of a deconstruction of what is your system in its current state today look like? How does that differ from what the recommended best practices are? And then how can I bridge that divide, leveraging my people, my resources, my tools, my technology, my organization, and my culture in such a way that their bidirectional influence contributes in a healthy way towards getting us to the goal, right? Processes correlate with outcomes. If your processes are flawed, I don't care if your outcomes are good or not, they're not going to stay good for long. So looking at it from a more holistic and back to basics approach, I think, is what's going to probably drive most of this.
Today, get back to basics, and then what do you see for the future?
So there's a couple of things I think the leveraging of the electronic medical record for decision support and for ensuring compliance is an underappreciated art. I think it's being more and more recognized. This has been something that I've been passionate about for quite a while. So for example, when we were working in a facility where we did active surveillance testing of all of our patients, and we had a robust electronic medical record, we were able to leverage that to develop a logistic regression model that predicted the probability that a patient was colonized or infected with a multi-drug resistant organism. And then we hardwired that into the electronic medical record, so it actually would indicate when that patient, because the patient's condition changes over time, and therefore their risk changes. So they come in for thing one, but they get administered an antibiotic. We know that antibiotics increase your risk. So they each contributed their relative weights and remained a dynamic, interactive assessment, ongoing assessment for that patient, such that when they crossed that threshold that we determined was no longer an acceptable threshold, it would send a decision support reminder or tool to both the provider and the nurse to order a surveillance test, because this patient probably does have an MDRO. And we were able to do that in such a way that it reduced our overall needs for testing, so it was financially feasible. It targeted our highest risk individuals and got them the decolonization or the transmission-based precautions that were warranted, and did so all behind the scenes. So there was a lot of work done up front that led to this end result in the back end. I use this as an example because we've been, figuring out how to use and leverage the electronic medical record in a variety of ways. And one of the questions is can it be used for predictive analytics? So for example, can it predict if the patient is more or less likely to develop eclampsia on hospital day 3 of having that line in place than they were on hospital day 2? And if there is an actionable item that you can associate with that and say, wait, now we really have to aggressively consider pulling that line unless it's absolutely medically necessary, or some sort of intervention that might help alleviate or reduce that risk. I think that's one option. And one thing, if you think about the amount of money, frankly, that hospitals pay to have these electronic medical records, and they do so, and they're good to have, but they're probably one of the most underutilized resources that you can possibly have. Again, connecting processes to outcomes, by the way, is the best way to drive compliance, right? So let's say you've got a program where you're trying to do nasal decolonization of your high-risk surgeries. If you're not actively calculating what your compliance is with that protocol, then you've got a problem. Because let's say you put in a process saying, I'm going to decolonize these high-risk patients, and then you never look back at it. How do you know it's getting done? When we measure, we know better. And so what you can do is you can go and, again, leverage the electronic medical record to give you the report of what that compliance looks like, and then plot that out and graph that with your surgical site infection rate. They don't always correlate with one another, but more often than not, processes do connect to outcomes. And especially if you take all the bundle elements that you're using or implementing to reduce your HAIs, measure them in some way, and then connect them to your outcomes, and it helps drive home the point of how important this is. Going back to TrueD, I did this at a hospital where I brought in 19 of those machines. And what I would do is I would actually plot compliance on a regularly scheduled basis, which means either weekly or monthly, share that with my environmental services department, and then on a regular basis, share with them on the same graph the rate of healthcare associated infections we were trying to prevent, like Clostridioides difficile. And they could actually see as their compliance was maintained or went up, they could see that their rate was going down, and that helps reinforce.
You were able to demonstrate that correlation. You can clearly demonstrate that correlation between a specific pathogen and the infection prevention activities. Is that what you're saying?
I think you can do that with any one of your processes that you're using for infection prevention. Definitely.
Are most facilities doing this? I feel like there is a disconnect, that it's hard to identify what my specific action, how it relates to the overall outcomes of infection prevention to a specific pathogen. Are most facilities doing this kind of analysis, or is that something more unique?
I think it's done to a greater or lesser extent in a majority of facilities, but it's probably underappreciated, right? So if you're just tracking your imperfect, and I guarantee you it's imperfect, your imperfect in hygiene compliance with your overall HAI SIRS, is that a process and outcomes connected data demonstration? Yeah. Is it a perfect one? Not even close. And I think that anytime you go down the path of a performance improvement effort to reduce HAIs, and you're bringing in something, a new tool, a new technology, you need to hardwire into that element of performance improvement. How are we going to measure this?
Right. Yeah, we have to achieve a meaningful, measurable impact, right? We're not going to be perfect, but if we can achieve a meaningful, measurable impact, then we're making progress.
Right. And it helps reinforce to your administration that the investment was worth it, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, infection preventionists, even in this post, call it post-pandemic, whatever you want to call it, we are a small but mighty group of influential subject matter experts that have credibility, but not very often do we have power or authority per se. And so credibility is sort of like poker chips. They're hard to earn, easy to lose, and you want to play your hand right.
Do you see that changing? Do you see infection preventionists having more of a say or authority on some of these decision practices since COVID?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think, I don't mean to say that we don't have any power. We don't have any power or authority. We do, but our power and our authority stems from our credibility, I guess is what my main point is. I think, when I started in infection prevention, it was very much like transitioning from the microbiology lab. Nobody knew where you were. You were in a dark basement, or something to that effect. And that changed very suddenly in my career with the consumer reports model and the transparency around healthcare associated infections. And now there's not a CEO in this country of a hospital that does not know their infection preventionist by name. Or if they are, they better be there on their first week on the job, or they certainly should be on their last week of the job.
So progress in the industry. We have a question, Mark, from Jordan. She says,
What
does the future of PDI look like, and what direction would you like to see it go in?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, one of the things I like about PDI is that they're never standing still. They're always looking for an opportunity to invest in new technology. I quite literally had a conversation earlier this morning with some of our research and development folks around what I see as a potential need, without going into too much details, because that will definitely get me into trouble. I think that the company of PDI is going to continue to innovate in the established space of environmental care, and look for opportunities to diversify into the newer spaces of interventional care for sure. I think that the future looks really bright, but I think that there's a couple of challenges coming. In 2033, I believe is the estimated date now, there's going to be this inversion in our nation's demographics where the number of people that are age 65 years of age or older are going to outnumber the number of people who are 18 years of age or younger. That poses some challenges, because if you ask people 65 years of age and older now where they want to spend their time, 90% of them say, I want to be at home. But we know that the health needs are going to be there as well. And so there's some very innovative practices that are going on in different parts of the country where they're trying to achieve both at the same time. I think Denver's probably got the best model of this, where you've got persons who are able to live as independently as possible, but that sometimes means that in the morning, someone from home health comes in and helps you with your activities of daily living to get you started. Then you go on a bus to a PACE center that has your nutritionist, your primary care provider, your pharmacist, your physical occupational therapist, your social worker, basically everything but the beauty salon and the grocery store, which I wouldn't be surprised if they put in there now. And then they take you home at the end of the day, and then that home health aide comes in there and helps you with your ADLs to get you into your bed. That's a phenomenal model. Is it financially sustainable and achievable for all Americans age 65 or plus 10 years from now? I don't know. But something is going to have to give. And with that, the dynamic of care and how it's delivered is going to change. And with that, PDI has to and will change with it. What we're trying to do is we're trying to anticipate what those needs are and then use that to drive product innovation and growth.
Mark, if people want to find out more about PDI Healthcare, where should they go?
It's great. The interwebs are a wonderful thing. PDIHC.com.
PDIHC.com. Our guest on Clean Talk today has been Marc-Oliver Wright, Clinical Science Liaison for PDI and a certified infection preventionist. Mark, thank you so much for being on Clean Talk today. We've really enjoyed having you as a guest. And if you're in the audience, be sure to join us on YouTube to catch the archival episode of Mark's podcast. And join us every Wednesday live at 3 p.m. Eastern time for another episode of Clean Talk. Until next Wednesday, I'm your host, Brad Whitchurch, for my guest, Marc-Oliver Wright, reminding you to keep it clean.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.